I need to tell you something before I start. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a healer, not a mystic, not any kind of specialist in anything that would make what happened make sense. I'm a field logistics coordinator for the Terran Resettlement Authority, which is a fancy title for someone who moves supplies, manages cargo manifests, and occasionally argues with customs officers across 17 different alien jurisdictions. I push paperwork. I drink bad coffee. I complain about the weather on every planet I land on. I am the least remarkable person in this story, which is, I think, the only reason any of it matters. My name is Corporal Marin Desjardins. I'm 34 years old, originally from a small town in northern Quebec, and I've been stationed on Relay Station Theta 9 for the past 2 years. Theta 9 sits at the intersection of 3 major trade routes: the Kolvari Corridor, the Sunward Reach, and what humans informally call the Dead Drift because nothing interesting was supposed to happen out there. It's a mid-sized station. About 11,000 residents, maybe 4,000 of them human, the rest a mix of species from across the coalition. It's not a glamorous posting. The light is always slightly wrong, too blue during station day, too amber at night, because the artificial cycles were calibrated for a species that sees in a slightly different spectrum than we do. You get used to it, mostly. Sometimes I still wake up at 3 in the morning, convinced the sun is broken. The day the call came, I was hip-deep in a manifest dispute with a Vhoring customs agent named Crix, who was insisting that 17 crates of agricultural seed stock had been mislabeled, and therefore required full biohazard quarantine processing, which would have taken 6 weeks. The seeds were for a colony of about 1,200 human trying to plant their first winter crop on a planet that only had 4 months before the temperature dropped below growing thresholds. 6 weeks wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for their harvest. I had been arguing with Crix for 3 hours. Crix had 8 limbs and a face that looked like a collapsed star, and a bureaucratic stubbornness that I genuinely respected even as it drove me insane. My comm pinged. I ignored it. I was in the middle of explaining, for the 5th time, why human agricultural seed stock was categorically different from Vhoring biological material and did not fall under the same quarantine provisions. It pinged again. And again. I held up one finger to Crix, which, I later learned, is a deeply offensive gesture in Vhoring culture, though Crix was too professional to mention it, and glanced at my wrist display. Unknown origin, Coalition Diplomatic Band, Priority Override. That last part made my stomach drop a little. Priority overrides on the diplomatic band were not for logistics coordinators. They were for ambassadors, station commanders, people who mattered. One moment, I told Crix, who clicked something in Vhoring that my translator rendered as a deeply skeptical acknowledgement. I stepped away from the counter and accepted the call. The voice that came through was not what I expected. It was male, older, speaking standard with an accent I didn't immediately place, something in the vowels that felt like it had traveled a long distance to reach me, not just in space but in time, like the voice of someone who had been speaking a language that wasn't their native tongue for so long that the original had faded to almost nothing. Is this Marin Desjardins? Corporal Marin Desjardins, Terran Resettlement Authority. Yes, who is this? A pause. Long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. My name is Vailthon Ethrix. I am the speaker delegate for the Ethrix Collective, representing our people in the Coalition Assembly. I knew the name. Everyone on Theta 9 knew the name. The Ethrix were one of the oldest species in the Coalition, one of the 5 founding members, deeply conservative in their politics and deeply private in their culture. Speaker Delegate Vailthon Ethrix was something like a senator and something like a priest rolled into one, and he had been a consistent and vocal critic of the Terran Expansion Treaty for the better part of a decade. I had, in fact, read 2 of his speeches in a briefing packet 6 months ago, and found myself thinking he was either a brilliant political mind or a deeply frightened one. Possibly both. I'm sorry, I said carefully. I think there may have been a routing error. I'm a logistics coordinator. I think you want. No, his voice was quiet but absolute. I want you specifically. I have been trying to find you for 11 days. The seeds were going to have to wait. I found a private alcove near the customs bay, a little recessed space between 2 cargo columns where the ambient sound dropped enough to have a real conversation, and I sat down on a packing crate and tried to understand what I was hearing. Vailthon Ethrix had a daughter. This was, in itself, a complicated thing. The Ethrix don't reproduce the way most species do. They form what they call a tesseran, a bonded group of 4 to 6 individuals whose genetic material and life force contribute to the creation of a new consciousness. It's not exactly having children in the human sense. It's closer to collaborative creation. A new Ethrix life emerges from the shared intention and substance of the tesseran group, and they are all, in their culture's understanding, equally the parents. But Vailthon called her his daughter. And when he said it, his voice did the thing that voices do when there is no other word that will carry the weight. Her name was Sylvie. She was, in Ethrix developmental terms, still young, the equivalent of about 11 or 12 human years, he thought, though he was careful to note that developmental equivalences were imprecise. She had been ill for 8 months. The Ethrix healers had tried everything they had. Coalition medical specialists had been brought in. 3 different treatment protocols had been attempted and failed. She was, in his words, fading. He paused for a long time after he said that. I didn't fill the silence. I've learned that sometimes the spaces between words are where the real things live. She has begun to refuse treatment, he finally said. Not because she has given up. She is not a child who gives up. She is stubborn. She gets that from me. But the treatments are, another pause, they are difficult. They hurt her, and she does not see the point of hurting for something that isn't working. I understood that. I didn't want to say so because it wasn't my place, but I understood it. The healers say we have perhaps 3 to 4 weeks. If she accepts further treatment, perhaps 6. She will not accept further treatment. I was very quiet. I was trying to understand why this man, this ancient, distinguished, politically formidable alien dignitary, was calling a 34-year-old logistics coordinator from Quebec with a pending seed manifest dispute. She has asked for something, Vailthon said. Every day for the last 2 months she has asked for the same thing. We have tried to give her what she asks for. We have tried alternatives. We have tried to, his voice shifted in a way my translator struggled with, something that landed in my ears as a sound between frustration and grief. We have tried to explain why what she wants is not possible. What does she want? I asked. Silence. She wants to see the human. I waited. A human came through our system 14 months ago, a supply convoy delayed by a drive malfunction. They made an emergency stop at Ethrix Station. Sylvie saw them from the observation deck. She had never seen humans before. He paused again, and I heard something that might have been a slow breath, or might have been whatever the Ethrix equivalent of a slow breath was. She was fascinated. She began reading everything she could find about your species. Everything in our archives, everything in the Coalition public records. She taught herself Standard because she wanted to read human literature, not translated, the original words. I felt something move in my chest, not pity, something more complicated than that. She has a favorite, he said. Among the humans she has read about, she found your personnel file through the Coalition public registry. You spoke at a resettlement hearing 2 years ago, advocating for the Vanthar colony. There is a recording. She has watched it, I do not know how many times. She said. He stopped. What did she say? I asked softly. She said you talk to people like they matter. A pause. She said you sound like someone who means what they say. I sat there on that packing crate in the cargo bay of Relay Station Theta 9 with the Blue Wrong Station light overhead and the smell of recycled air and machine oil all around me, and I felt absolutely, completely unequipped for this moment. "The last wish," he said. "My daughter's last wish is to meet you, to speak with you, just once." Another pause, longer this time. I know this is not a thing one typically asks. I know you do not know us. I know this is. "When do you need me there?" I asked. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It had texture to it. Wait. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different too. Something in it had shifted, a quality I couldn't name, something that felt ancient and raw and almost unbearable. "I have a shuttle. It can be at Theta 9 within 18 hours. I looked back toward the customs counter, where Crix was waiting with 8 arms and a bureaucratic grudge, and the fates of 1,200 colonists' winter crops in his hands. "I need to make one call first," I said, "and then I'll be ready." I called my supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Yale Frisch, and explained the situation in about 90 seconds flat. Yale had been running logistics operations in coalition space for 12 years and had the enviable quality of being able to process unusual situations without visible emotional disruption. There was a 3-second pause. "You're telling me the Ethrix speaker delegate called your personal comm on the diplomatic band because his dying kid wants to meet you?" "Yes." "The same speaker delegate who voted against the Terran Expansion Treaty 3 times?" "I think so." Another pause. "Go," she said. "I'll get someone else on the seeds." "Thank you." "Desjardins, be careful. Ethrix politics they're complicated. If something goes wrong while you're in their space." "Nothing's going to go wrong." "You don't know that." "No," I agreed, "but I'm going anyway." She made a sound that I've come to recognize as her version of reluctant respect. "Yeah, I know you are. I'll file the leave papers. Check in when you're in transit." I went back to the customs counter. Crix was waiting with what I had come to read as V'horing patience, which looks like stillness but feels like pressure. "I'm sorry," I said. "I have an emergency." Crix's 8 eyes regarded me with something that might have been suspicion and might have been curiosity. "The seeds," Crix said. "The seeds are agricultural, not biological. Chapter 7, Section 12, Clause 4 of the Coalition Trade Compact makes the distinction clearly. If you apply biohazard protocols to human agricultural seeds, you are in violation of the compact, and I will have to file a formal dispute with the trade authority, which neither of us wants." I met the cluster of eyes calmly. "But I trust your judgment, Crix. You're a thorough official. You'll reach the right conclusion." I turned and walked toward the transit hub. Behind me, I heard Crix click something. My translator rendered it as humans. I took that as a compliment. The shuttle arrived at Theta 9 dock 16 hours and 43 minutes later, ahead of schedule, which told me something about how much the speaker delegate had not wanted to keep me waiting. It was an Ethrix vessel, which meant it was beautiful in a way that felt slightly wrong, like something that had been grown rather than built. The hull had a faint iridescence to it. The lines were organic, curving in places where most ships were angular, suggesting a design philosophy that valued flow over efficiency. Or maybe, for the Ethrix, those were the same thing. The pilot who met me at the dock was not Ethrix. She was human, a small, precise woman in a neutral gray uniform with no insignia I recognized. She introduced herself as Davin, offered no last name, and told me the transit time to Ethrix station would be approximately 26 hours. She was polite and professional and volunteered nothing. I respected that. The ship was quiet. The Ethrix design sensibility extended to the interior, curved walls, soft ambient light that pulsed gently in a rhythm that I gradually realized was synchronized with the station's own environmental systems, which were in turn calibrated to something like a heartbeat. Slow, steady, almost like being inside something living. I sat in the passenger compartment and tried to prepare. I didn't know what preparing meant in this context. I didn't know what a dying Ethrix child looked like. I didn't know what they needed from me specifically or what I was supposed to do when I got there. I wasn't a healer. I wasn't a diplomat. I wasn't a person who knew how to handle things like this. But I thought about what she had said, through her father's voice but still her words. She said you talk to people like they matter. I pressed my back against the curved wall of the shuttle and looked out the porthole at the stars moving past, and I thought about the resettlement hearing 2 years ago. I hadn't thought about it in a long time. It had been a frustrating, grinding process, arguing before a coalition panel for resettlement rights for a human colony that had been caught in a jurisdictional dispute when a border realignment changed which authority governed their planet. For 8 months, 1,200 people had been living in legal limbo, their land claims unrecognized, their right to remain technically in question. I remembered being very tired. I remembered that the panel had been hearing testimony all day, and the room had the dull, heavy quality of a space where too many important decisions had been made, and no one was really listening anymore. I remembered thinking, these are real people. Someone in that room needs to hear that these are real people. So I talked about them like they were, not statistics, not a case number. I talked about the woman in Lot 7 who had planted a peach tree the year she arrived because she was so sure they were going to stay. About the kids who had started a school in someone's barn because they didn't want to fall behind. About the old man, I couldn't remember his name now, but I remembered his face from the photograph in the case file, who had walked the perimeter of his land every morning since he arrived, not to check anything, just to know it was still there. I hadn't thought anyone was really listening. But a child on Ethrix Station had watched the recording. An alien child who had never met a human, who was learning their language from scratch, who was sick and fading, and had decided, out of everything in the universe she could ask for, that she wanted to meet the tired logistics coordinator from the resettlement hearing. The stars moved past, the ship breathed. I pulled out my tablet and started reading everything I could find about Ethrix culture. I had 26 hours. I was going to use them. Ethrix Station appeared on the approach as a slow revelation. Most stations are built to be functional. You see the engineering before you see anything else, the trusses, the docking arrays, the communication spines. Ethrix Station was built to be something else. From a distance, it looked like a crystal formation, like something that had grown in the dark of space over millions of years and arranged itself by its own internal logic. The solar panels were woven into the architecture rather than bolted onto it. The docking ports were positioned along graceful curves that served double purpose as structural supports. The observation decks. There were many jutted at angles that caught the light from the nearest star and scattered it in patterns that shifted as you moved closer. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen that was made rather than born. And it was very quiet. Every station has a sound, a baseline frequency of machinery and movement and life. Theta 9 sounds like a city market and an engine room had a disagreement and then decided to coexist. Ethrix Station sounded like a library, like a cathedral. The sounds were there. The mechanical necessities of a functioning space station don't disappear just because you find them aesthetically inconvenient, but they were somehow woven into a frequency that was easy, that didn't grate. Everything ran at a register that was just below the threshold of active notice. I thought about what it meant that a child had grown up here and been fascinated by humanity. By us, chaotic, loud, resource-intensive, adaptable, stubborn, grieving, laughing humanity. We must have seemed like something from another dimension entirely. Maybe that was part of it. Davin brought the shuttle in smoothly and we docked at a lower port. An Ethrix attendant met us at the gangway. They were tall, most Ethrix are, by human standards. Veilthon had explained in our call that the average Ethrix stands about 2.1 meters, with 4 arms arranged in 2 pairs, the inner pair shorter and more dexterous, the outer pair longer and used primarily for stability and broader motion. Their skin, not quite the right word for it, but the closest one, was a deep, muted blue-gray that shifted subtly toward green in certain lights. Their features were arranged on a broader face than a human's, with 3 eyes positioned for nearly panoramic vision, and a mouth that was wide but thin, built for a language with a much larger sound range than human vocal anatomy could manage. The attendant said something. My translator rendered it as a formal greeting and an expression of gratitude for my presence. I said, "Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here." Which was true. Strange and uncertain and completely unprepared as I was glad to be there. They led me through corridors that were both alien and somehow immediately comprehensible, in the way that good design always is. The path to wherever they were taking me curved and opened, like moving through a very slow exhalation. The light shifted as I walked, warmer, I noticed, than the station's ambient light. Calibrated, I realized, for human eyes. Someone had adjusted the corridor lighting specifically for my walk from the dock. That small thing hit me harder than I expected. Veilthon Ethrix was waiting in an anteroom outside, what I understood to be the station's medical wing. He was older than I'd expected, though I couldn't have said what I was expecting exactly. He had the bearing of someone who had spent a long time being authoritative in rooms that required it. He was tall, as Ethrix generally were, and his coloring was a deeper, slightly more muted shade than the attendant who'd met me. A quality I'd read in my hours of preparation indicated age and status in Ethrix social signaling, though the precise meaning of the shift was complex enough that I didn't want to pretend I understood it. What I understood was the way he stood when I walked in. It was the posture of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and had not been sure the thing they were waiting for would come. He said something in Ethrix, then caught himself, then said in standard, careful, considered, each word placed deliberately, "You came." I said I would, I told him. He looked at me for a long moment. 3 eyes, and all 3 of them doing that thing that happens when someone is trying to read you completely in a very short amount of time, because they don't have the luxury of getting it wrong. "I should tell you," he said, "that several of my advisors strongly recommended against this." A pause. They were concerned about the optics of the speaker delegate seeking a personal favor from a Terran citizen. They were concerned about what it might signal politically. "What did you tell them?" A very small pause. "I told them that my daughter was dying and she had asked for one thing, and I was going to give it to her if I had to dismantle the coalition assembly with my own hands." I nodded slowly. Good answer. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, the Ethrix face isn't built for human smiles, but something adjacent, something that recognized something. "She is," he started. "She has good days and difficult days. Today is," he stopped. "I should let you see for yourself. I will warn you that she may be sleeping. The healers have given her something for the pain and it makes her." "I understand," I said quietly. "If she is sleeping, we can." "I'll wait," I said. He looked at me again, that comprehensive, careful look. "Yes," he said more softly than before. "I thought you would say that." The room was quieter than the corridor, which I hadn't thought was possible. It had the particular stillness of a space where people had learned to move carefully, to be cautious with sound and light, because the person at the center of it was precious and fragile, and both of those things at once. It wasn't a sterile room. That surprised me. I'd expected the institutional severity of a medical facility, but the room was lived in. There were things on the shelves, objects, fabrics, items whose purposes I couldn't identify but whose presence was clearly personal. The light was very soft, the blue-green ambient of the station's standard palette, but dimmed. There was a window, or what served as a window, a viewport cut into the outer hull, and through it the stars were visible. Steady. Patient. She was in the bed. Sylvie. The name means something in Ethrix that my translator handled as light that moves through water, which felt, looking at her, both perfectly right and heartbreakingly insufficient. She was smaller than I'd expected. In my reading, I'd absorbed that young Ethrix were smaller proportionally than adults, that their secondary limb pairs hadn't fully developed, that their coloring was lighter and more variable. But reading that and seeing a small form in a bed, slightly sunken into the bedding, with the particular stillness of someone who has been resting because there's nothing else they're permitted to do, that was different. Her eyes were closed. I stood in the doorway. Veilthon stood just behind me, and I was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, a presence, a pressure, something that changed the atmosphere of a space just by being in it. I moved to the chair that had been placed beside the bed, sat down, folded my hands. The room breathed. I looked at her face. In sleep, Ethrix faces relax into something that is both strange and, I don't know how to say this without it sounding sentimental, but I'll say it anyway, they relax into something that is unmistakably vulnerable. The three eyes closed, the broad face softened, the two pairs of hands loosened from whatever they held during waking hours. She had something resting near one hand, an object, flat and rectangular, that it took me a moment to recognize. A tablet. And on the tablet, the screen still faintly lit, was text. Standard text, human text. I leaned slightly, careful not to disturb anything, just enough to see. It was a novel. One of the old ones, late 20th century, a battered classic that had been digitized and archived, and found its way into 100 different library systems over 100 years, and apparently into the hands of a young Ethrix girl who was learning Standard specifically, so she could read it in the original language. I looked at the page she'd stopped on. She'd highlighted a line. The translator function was active. She'd been comparing the Standard text to the Ethrix rendering, but she'd gone back and highlighted the Standard original. The line read, "It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." I stared at that for a moment. Then I looked up, and she was looking at me. I don't know how to fully describe the moment she opened her eyes. The medical reports, I was shown them later, as part of the official record, indicated that for the 6 days prior to my arrival, Sylvie had not been able to remain upright for more than a few minutes at a time. That the neural fatigue from her illness made sustained activity very difficult, that her periods of wakefulness had been growing shorter. The reports documented what happened next. She opened her eyes, she saw me, and she sat up. Not slowly, not with the careful, managed movement of someone conserving energy. She sat up the way you sit up when something important happens and your body responds before your mind has finished processing it. The blanket fell from her shoulders. Her inner hands reached forward and braced against the mattress. Her outer hands steadied the air, a reflexive balance gesture that I'd read was common in Ethrix children. And she looked at me with three eyes that were very, very awake. Behind me, I heard Veilthon make a sound. I couldn't identify it exactly. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on her. She said something, in Ethrix. My translator worked for a second, then rendered it as, "You're real." I said, "Yes, I'm real." She switched to Standard. It was careful, deliberate Standard, the Standard of someone who had taught it to themselves and was taking very seriously the weight of using it correctly. "I watched your testimony," she said. "About the people on," she paused, reaching for the word, "on the planet, where they planted the tree." My throat did something uncomfortable. "I remember," I said. "You said," she stopped, collected herself. One of her inner hands rose and touched the tablet beside her, a reflexive gesture like touching something familiar for steadiness. You said that the definition of a home is a place worth fighting for, even when the fighting is difficult. She looked at me carefully. I wrote it down. I remember saying something like that, I told her. I'm a little surprised it was recorded. Everything is recorded, she said, and there was a very slight quality in her voice that might have been, in a human child, the beginning of an eye roll. The observation that adults perpetually forget that everything is recorded, even the things they think are private. The coalition archives everything. That's terrifying, I said. And she made a sound, short, unexpected. It took me a second to recognize it as laughter, rendered through Ethric's vocal anatomy. It was different from human laughter, a different frequency, a different rhythm, but the quality of it was unmistakable. Surprise at something unexpectedly funny, delight at being caught off guard. I heard Veilthon behind me, very quietly say something in Ethric's. My translator didn't catch it. I think it was too quiet and too private for the translator to process, but I didn't need the translation. We talked for a long time. I hadn't planned what I was going to say. I'd spent 26 hours on the shuttle reading about Ethric's culture and had come up with approximately nothing in the way of a plan, which was probably for the best, because any plan I'd formed would have been wrong. You can't plan your way through talking to someone who is dying. You can only show up and be there and say true things and listen carefully. So that's what I did. She asked me about humans, not the general, textbook version. She'd clearly read all of that already. She asked me about specific things. Things she'd found interesting or confusing or fascinating in her reading. She asked me why humans named their boats. She asked me why human music used repetition so extensively, why a chorus needed to come back over and over. She asked me what snow felt like. She'd read about snow. She'd seen recordings. She wanted to know if the descriptions were accurate. I tried to tell her. I said it was heavier than it looked from a distance. That the first time you walked through deep snow, the shock of it, the way your foot kept going further than you expected, was alarming in a funny way. That it was very cold, but also in certain lights, certain conditions, almost unbearably beautiful. That there was a particular quality to snow silence that didn't exist anywhere else. The way it absorbed sound made the world feel closer and hushed and private. She listened to all of this with the focused intensity of someone taking notes. Then she asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Are you afraid," she said, "of things, normal things, not," she paused, searching for the word, "not large fears, small fears, everyday ones." I thought about it. "Yes," I said honestly. "I'm afraid of failing people who need things from me. I'm afraid of being wrong when being wrong matters. I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing in an important moment, a beat. I'm afraid of spiders, which is probably less philosophically interesting." She made that sound again, the Ethric's laugh. "I'm afraid of," she started, then paused. She looked at her hands, the inner pair, the smaller and more dexterous ones. "I'm afraid that when I'm gone, the people who," another pause, longer. "I'm afraid that I'm not interesting enough to be worth," she stopped. I waited. "Worth remembering," she said quietly. There's a thing that happens when a child says something heartbreaking, not a dramatic soap opera heartbreak, the quiet kind, the true kind, the kind that hits a place in you that's very old and very tired and very sincere. "I watched your testimony," she continued, still looking at her hands, "about the people who planted the tree, and I thought those people will be remembered because she talked about them, because she made the panel hear about the tree. People are remembered when someone talks about them." She looked up at me. "I thought if I could talk to you, maybe." She stopped herself. "Sylvie," I said. She looked at me. "I'm going to tell people about you," I said. "Not because I feel like I have to, and not because of today. Because you are, genuinely, one of the most remarkable people I've met in 2 years of working in coalition space. You learned a foreign language from scratch so you could read books in the original. You highlighted a line about choices mattering more than abilities in a human novel while you were sick and hurting and fighting. You reached across 3 trade corridors and a political divide that's been running for a decade to ask for one conversation. I stopped. That's not forgettable. That's the opposite of forgettable. She was very still. I'm going to tell people about the girl on Ethrix Station, I said, and they're going to be glad they heard about you. She made a sound that was not the laugh, something quieter, something that needed its own word that I don't think Standard has. I was there for 3 days. The healers were careful with her energy. They allowed our visits in measured sessions, monitoring her closely, ready to end things if she showed signs of strain. She showed signs of strain, she was ill, very ill, and sitting up and talking was genuinely costing her something. But she was also stubbornly, recognizably refusing to acknowledge that. She pushed the sessions as long as she could. She asked questions right up until the moment the healers very gently, but firmly said they needed her to rest. On the second day, she asked me to tell her a story. What kind? I asked. Human, she said, real from your life. I thought about it. Then I told her about the first time I'd been sent solo to negotiate a supply routing dispute on a Kolvari platform, 6 months into my posting, and I'd been so nervous that I'd drunk 3 cups of the Kolvari equivalent of coffee before the meeting, not knowing that Kolvari stimulants have approximately 8 times the effect on human neurochemistry that they do on Kolvari. And I'd spent the entire 2-hour negotiation sitting very still and trying very hard not to vibrate visibly. She laughed for so long at that one that the healer who'd been monitoring from the doorway made a small concerned noise that turned out to be Ethrix for something like I cannot believe what I'm witnessing. On the 3rd day, her father came and sat with us. He didn't say much. He was a man, a person, who had spent a lifetime in rooms where saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment was his particular exhausting expertise, and he seemed relieved in that room to have nothing required of him. He just sat. He listened to his daughter talk. He listened to me answer. Occasionally he would say something, and Sylvie would respond, and they would have a few exchanges in Ethrix that I couldn't follow and didn't try to. It was enough to be in the room. At the end of the 3rd day, when the healer was signaling that our session was coming to a close, Sylvie looked at me and said, "Will you come back?" I had a seed manifest dispute waiting for me. I had 1,200 colonists' winter crops in regulatory limbo. I had a career that was professionally modest and geographically inconvenient and exactly mine. "Yes," I said. "Promise." "Yes." She settled back against her pillows with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been given something real, not managed, not gently redirected, something real. "Okay," she said, "I'll be here." Vale Thon walked me back to the docking bay. We didn't talk much. There wasn't a great deal to say, in the way that there sometimes isn't a great deal to say after something has already been said more fully than words can manage. At the dock he stopped. "I voted against the Terran Expansion Treaty," he said, 3 times. "I know," I said. I told myself it was policy, strategic interest, concern about coalition resource allocation. A pause. "I was afraid of you, of your species, of the way you expand, the way you move through the universe like you have a right to it." He looked at me carefully. "I am still sometimes afraid of that." "That's fair," I said. "We're a lot." Something moved through his expression. "Yes," another pause, "but Sylvie isn't afraid. She never has been." He said it like a fact and a mystery and a source of pride all at once. "She reads your books and learns your language and wants to know what snow feels like, and it never occurs to her that your species might not be worth knowing." I didn't say anything. "She is right," he said quietly, "and I am wrong, or at least not entirely right." He looked down at his 4 hands for a moment. "I thought you should know that." I held out my hand. Human gesture, I knew. He might not recognize it. He looked at it. Then carefully, he extended one of his inner hands and placed it in mine. The grip was different from a human handshake, different anatomy, different pressure, different duration, but the meaning translated perfectly. "Thank you," he said, "for coming." "Thank you for calling," I said. Epilogue, official record and aftermath. From the personal file of Corporal Marin Desjardins, Terran Resettlement Authority, year 2387. I want to be clear about something, because I know how this story sounds, and I know what people tend to take from it. It is not a story about humans being special. It is not a story about one person saving another person, or one species reaching another species, or any of the clean, triumphant things that stories are supposed to be about. Sylvie is still sick. The healers are still working. She has had better weeks and harder weeks in the month since I came home. She has started writing short pieces in Standard which she shares with me over Coalition Com. They're good. They're strange and precise, and they approach human ideas from angles that make the ideas feel new, which is the thing I love most about them. She's 12 years old, in rough equivalent, and she writes like someone who has been paying very close attention to a world she finds endlessly interesting. I have gone back twice. I intend to go back again. Vailthon Ethrix has not changed his vote on the Terran Expansion Treaty. He's introduced 2 amendments, which the analysts say are significant concessions and which he describes as clarifications. I'm not a diplomat. I don't know what that means for the larger picture. But he sent me a message 3 weeks ago. Just a single line, in Standard, careful, deliberate, chosen. She showed her healer the line she highlighted. He asked her what it meant. She explained it to him for 40 minutes. I read that message about 6 times. Then I went and did my job and argued with a customs official about hazardous material classifications, and drank terrible coffee, and thought about a girl on Ethrix Station who was learning the universe one question at a time and not afraid of any of it. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a healer. I'm not a diplomat or a mystic or a specialist in anything that should matter in a story like this. But I showed up. And sometimes, not always, not even usually, but sometimes showing up is the whole thing. From the testimony of healer Vresalian Cathara, Ethrix Station Medical Division, recorded year 2388. I have been practicing medicine on Ethrix Station for 31 years. In that time, I have seen many things that my training did not fully prepare me for. I was not prepared for Sylvie Ethrix Desara to sit up. I should be clear. By every metric we had, by the full weight of everything we understood about the progression of her condition, she should not have had the neurological reserves to achieve a full, unassisted upright position. The fatigue factor in the final stage of her illness is not merely physical. It affects the integration of voluntary movement with intent. It affects the fundamental coherence of the signal between what the mind wishes to do and what the body can perform. She sat up, quickly, with what I can only describe from a clinical perspective as vigor. I reviewed the monitoring data afterward. At the moment she opened her eyes and saw the human Corporal Desjardins, there was a significant shift in her neural integration patterns. Not a sudden spike, not an anomaly, a settling, as though some friction that had been present in her neural matrix for months abruptly reduced, as though she had been holding something at arm's length for a long time and had simply, finally, set it down. I cannot explain this in clinical terms. I've tried. My colleagues have tried. We've written 3 different internal reports. None of them satisfy me. The closest I can come is this. She had been waiting for something, and the waiting itself had cost her. When the waiting ended, the cost stopped being withdrawn. I don't know what the human said to her. I don't know what the human is. I know she is not a healer and not a medical specialist and not anything, by our classification systems, that should have had this effect. But I know what I measured. And I know what I saw. And I find that I am, for the first time in my career, grateful for something that I cannot explain. From the personal journal of Vailthon Ethrix, Speaker Delegate to the Coalition Assembly, year 2388, personal record, not for archive. Sylvie asked me today what I remembered about calling the human. I told her I remembered being afraid she would say no, afraid she would agree and then find some reason not to come. Afraid that even if she came, it would not be what Sylvie needed, and I would have spent the political capital of the call for nothing, and she would fade knowing that even her last wish had fallen short. Sylvie considered this. Then she said, "You were afraid of the wrong thing." I asked her what she meant. She said, "You were afraid she wouldn't come, but the real thing was she did come. That part was never actually uncertain. You just didn't know it yet." I told her I didn't understand. She said, "I watched her testimony 17 times. I knew she would come." She looked at me with those 3 young eyes that have always, since the first moment I understood there was a she in the Tesserine to understand, seen things I have missed entirely. I was afraid of something else. I asked her what. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that she would come and it wouldn't be real, that she would be one thing on the recording and another thing in the room. She paused. That I had built something in my mind that the real person couldn't hold. And I said. She smiled. Ethrix faces are not configured for the human smile, but she has learned it, she has been practicing it, for reasons she considers obvious. She turned the approximation of it on me with absolute sincerity. "She's better," Sylvie said, "than the recording. She's better in person." From a communiqué sent by Corporal Marin Desjardins to the Coalition Archive for Interspecies Relations, year 2388, submitted voluntarily for public record. I don't write things for archives normally. I push cargo manifests, but someone at the archive reached out and asked if I'd be willing to add something to the record, and I figured I'd try. Here's what I know. 11 months ago, a man called me on a diplomatic comm band to tell me his daughter was sick and her last wish was to see me. It was the strangest call I've ever received. It was also the most important. I went, that's the whole of what I did. I got on a shuttle and went. What happened when I got there is harder to describe. A small person in a bed sat up. We talked about snow and old novels and the names of boats and the repetition in music choruses. She told me she was afraid of not being worth remembering. I told her I was going to remember her. I'm still keeping that promise. I'll keep it the way you keep promises to people who mean them, not as an obligation but as something you carry by choice because it's worth carrying. Sylvie is still here. Some weeks are harder than others. She started writing, which I've mentioned elsewhere, but I want to say it again because I think it's important. She's writing, in standard, about what she sees when she looks at the universe from Ethrix Station. The pieces are strange and funny and sometimes heartbreaking, and they are, genuinely, the most interesting things I've read this year. If someone at the archive ever figures out how to publish Ethrix children's essays in standard translation, please let me know. We think there's an audience. Closing note, Archivist Thessavane Krell, Office of Interspecies Relations, year 2389. The formal record of this event does not capture most of what matters about it. This is, in my experience, true of most formal records. What the monitoring data shows is that a human civilian traveled 26 hours to sit beside a sick child and talk with her about snow. What the monitoring data does not show is the quality of attention she brought to the room, the fact that she brought nothing to prove, the absence of performance in every exchange. There is a word in Ethrix that has no direct standard equivalent. It is Vithrin. The closest approximation is something like the quality of being genuinely present for something outside yourself. It implies a kind of attention that costs something, not just time, not just effort, but the willingness to be actually changed by what you encounter, rather than merely to process it and move on. The healers used the word Vithrain to describe Corporal Desjardins. It is not a word the Ethrix use lightly. Sylvie Ethrix Dessara continues to receive treatment. As of the time this archive entry is compiled, she has survived significantly beyond the initial prognosis. Her healers are careful not to make claims they cannot support. They say that they are monitoring carefully. They say that they do not know why the trajectory changed. They say that some things are not, yet, within the scope of what they know how to measure. Corporal Marin Desjardins returned to Theta 9 and filed a formal dispute with the Coalition Trade Authority regarding the biohazard quarantine of Terran agricultural seed stock. She won. The seeds were released. The colony on Vanthar 7 had their winter crop. She is currently involved in a new resettlement dispute involving approximately 800 humans on a moon that has been caught in a jurisdiction transfer. She is, by all accounts, fighting about it with her characteristic stubborn precision. The Ethrix speaker delegate has not changed his formal position on the Terran Expansion Treaty. He has, however, requested a copy of Sylvie's most recent standard essay to be entered into the Coalition Assembly's Cultural Exchange Archive. The essay is titled, "What Snow Sounds Like When It Falls, a Theory by Someone Who Has Never Seen It." It has been downloaded, as of this writing, 14,000 times. We humans are, in the estimation of this archivist, an exhausting and improbable and occasionally extraordinary species. We show up to things we have no preparation for. We talk to people like they matter. We sit beside the sick and the afraid, and we say true things, and we stay. And sometimes, not always, not by any mechanism that can be reliably reproduced or formally documented, sometimes that is exactly enough.